We're going to hear now from other people who were involved in the organisation of the festival, and also those who, in one way or another, were inspired by it and had an impact on them and their careers. So Nur Sobers-Khan, my colleague from British Library, the curator for South Asia, is going to be chairing the event. So I'm going to pass over to her now.
Okay, great. I think Daniel just said it all, but thank you very much for that introduction. Before we proceed, I actually just want to thank Sadia, where is she, for her... Where is she hiding? I don't see her, but okay. She's in the corner there, but she really made this event possible, so we want to thank her and her team at Everyday Muslim Archive for all of their work, so a huge thank you to them. So in this section, basically each speaker will have about 10 minutes to talk about their experience of the World of Islam Festival, how it affected them, their trajectory, their interpretation of it. And then we'll also have the chance for you to ask questions and to engage in a discussion about the legacy of the festival, the meaning of the festival, and whether such an undertaking would be possible today. So I'll hand over to Professor Oliver Watson, who is the IMP Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at the Khalili Research Centre in Oxford.
Thank you. Can you hear? Yes. I'm rather reticent in speaking at all here because my role in the Arts of Islam Festival was as the most low form of life employed in it. But there's been a certain satisfaction here that when I worked in on the exhibition in the Hayward Gallery, and that's all I'm going to talk about, it was my only experience there, that was the first paid employment I had in this field. And now we're celebrating 40 years and I'm retiring this summer. So it comes back. I think the exhibition at the Hayward Gallery has been a victim of its own success because since the 70s, we've had so many spectacular shows with extraordinary catalogues and extraordinary events around them that it makes this rather modest publication and the show that was there seem rather small. But in fact, it was an extraordinary event to have organised. At the time, you would have had to go back to the 1931 exhibition in London of Persian art to get to any exhibition of anything like the same ambition and scope, and of course that only dealt with Iran. And before that, the only comparable exhibition would have been the 1910 one in Munich. So to have got together, to persuaded the powers that be to put on an exhibition, to have brought together over 650 objects from 32 countries in the Hayward Gallery, objects of extraordinary importance, some of the greatest, most iconic, most important individual works of art, to have brought them together and to have produced a catalogue that illustrated them all. Now we say, well, they're all small black and white pictures. We'd expect sort of large colour ones. At the time, this, I remember, was an argument of persuading the Arts Council that they should illustrate every object. And this catalogue became the sort of standard work to refer to. All these important objects in every kind of media, an illustration, a bibliography, transcription and translation of the inscriptions. This was an enormously important work. The Brabinski bucket, the famous piece of medieval metalwork from Khorasan, the Besard Bustan, the greatest manuscript in the Cairo Library, the Gulbenkian enamelled vase, thing this big found in China, the Petzoli hunting carpet. I mean, they're just on and on and on, some of the great, great works of art. Now, for my own involvement in this, I was just extraordinarily lucky. I had just started a PhD at SOAS. I was working with Geza Fehrbari there, and Rafe Pinder-Wilson from the British Museum was a sort of co-supervisor, and he brought me in initially to help him do the ceramic entries in the catalogue. And from that, I was then invited by the wonderful Joanna Drew, head of exhibitions at the Arts Council, to be the registrar at the Hayward Gallery. So I was employed. I was the only one on the, as it were, Hayward Gallery team allowed to handle any of these objects. So when they arrived, they were unpacked. I had to photograph them to get condition reports on them, so photograph, study them in detail. I had to store them, I had to, whenever they moved. What it meant for a young scholar like me was that I had the chance to handle and study intimately all these great works of art. And I have to say, this is an experience on which I still live now as I head to retirement. That understanding that comes through the hands, the actual hand, the materiality, the thingness of these objects, which is so important really in understanding them as works of art, and which is more and more difficult for young scholars to achieve. So I had that direct access. I could fill a whole hour's talk with wonderful anecdotes about what happened at the Hayward Gallery. The one thing I regret I didn't do was follow Joanna Drew, who confessed to me that one night at 11 o'clock at night, when nobody was much around, she took off her shoes, walked into the middle of the great Persian hunting carpet and sat on it to experience how a grand classic carpet of this kind really would have been experienced by the patrons of it. Or Ivanov arriving from the Hermitage late one night, unexpected, banging on the front doors of the Hayward Gallery. There he was, beaming face, excited, and we said, what on earth, we weren't expecting, what on earth are you doing here? He said, well, I flew in on Aeroflot, there was nobody to meet me, so how did you get here? Oh, well, I took the underground from Heathrow to Embankment and walked over the bridge, carrying bags with the great manuscripts and the objects from the Hermitage. And we said, what about the paperwork? He said, oh, no problem, I walked through the nothing to declare channel. It took weeks to sort that out. Absolute nightmare. For me, this was an extraordinary experience. I gained, as I say, so much. I still have the sets of photographs, some allowed, some not quite so allowed, that I took of all the objects there. And I suppose I benefited even more because it was only 3 years later that the Victoria and Albert Museum decided to appoint its first Islamic specialist. They'd had people who'd studied Islamic objects before, the great Arthur Lane, for instance, but he was also a specialist in lots of other ceramic things. They created an Islamic curatorship, which I was very lucky then to be appointed to, and that started my career in museums that carried on from there. And of course, this exhibition and the excitement that it generated, I think, was not only pioneering, but energizing for the whole interest in Islamic art and the following things that have happened since, particularly in the 70s, in the 80s and 90s, and up to our own day. Even more reticence to say something about the exhibition itself. It would be an extremely difficult exhibition to put on again now, not only because it would be extremely difficult to get all those sets of objects together, but also because 2 years after this exhibition, Said published his book Orientalism. And now this may be just a topic amongst art historians, but that generated a whole sort of sets of art historians whose careers have been based on examining and deconstructing Western interpretations of Islamic art and criticisms of Orientalism and the rest of it. And it has to be said that this exhibition would be vulnerable to some criticism of that kind, that it attempts in a sort of unifying way as a sort of reductive essentialist argument to say there is something here that we can say which captures all of the varied experience of extraordinarily different countries, peoples, right across from Spain, right across to Central Asia, over 1,500 years. It also slightly ducks some of the awkward questions, figuration, for instance, by leaving out some of the very important figural objects. So, yes, we have the Brabinski bucket, but we don't have the Baptistère de Saint-Louis. We have some of the Cordoban ivories, we don't have the Moreira casket. And these are questions. Well, this is maybe just academic talk for art historians in their own privacy. But even that said, one has to say that this exhibition and this modest book is the foundation of what, as it were, contemporary interest and the driving force of interest in Islamic art has been. culmination of which I think is very soon. The Metropolitan Museum is opening a big exhibition on Seljuk art. There will be a wonderful catalogue which will make this one look modest, but this is where it all started.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Is this on? Hello. Yes, thank you very much for that, and for the art historical, philosophical considerations that we can perhaps discuss afterward. So we'll move on to our next speaker, Professor Salim Al-Hassani, who is the Emeritus Professor of Mechanical Engineering and is currently an Honorary Professorial Fellow at the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester.
Thank you so much. Like you have admired Abdullah, the son of Paul Ahmed Keeler, all right. Of course, if you see the son of Abdullah, the grandson, who is now a Hafiz in the city of Fez, you will then realize how miracles do happen. Right? It's really, the process of how that Allah, God, one guides people, and how, fruits of trees come out and so on. It was really amazing. So my association is different. It's like the Son of the World of Islam Festival, I think, is the 1001 Inventions exhibition that is now recently emerged in the UK, again highly influenced by non-Muslims in its beginning, just like the World of Islam Festival. And I happen to be one of those who have worked very hard to see this exhibition come to life. And I realize how difficult it must have been for Ahmed Paul Keeler at the time. We talked about £10,000 haul in his, we're talking about £1 million haul. But God is great. This exhibition that I'm associated with has become a campaign, and it had developed effectively a small section of the World of Islam Festival, and that is the science section, the book that Sayyid Hussein Nasr had written. And there was just that little, there was also the making of a water clock by the British Museum at the time. And of course, being a mechanical engineer, I had been quite a distance from art and also from history. And then a colleague of mine, who was professor of history of science and technology at UMIST, he said to me one day, Salim, what are you going to do with your life? I said, what do you mean? It was 1991. He said, well, look, I've studied history of science all my life, and I find that there is a gap about 1,000 years. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, we jump from the Greek to the Renaissance, and there's nothing. Sometimes we call it Dark Ages, Medieval Ages, and so on. And I said, yeah. He said, well, it's to do with Muslim civilization. I said, yeah. He said, well, we see you being, Muslim, you run away to go and do your prayers, and you come from Baghdad. So obviously, we've got a role here or something. I said, me, how can I have a role in this? He said, well, look, you've done everything you can, very well distinguished. You are the one who brings the highest amount of money in projects to the university. And, I said, look, I hate history. He said, why? I said, because the history that I have been taught when I was a young boy in Baghdad was history of people killing each other, right? Of dynasties, and fighting. He says, no, look, the history you should look to is the history of science. Have a look at those great scientists who have, they could become probably role models for someone like you. And I said, okay, I'll try and see. And ever since, I never give it up, because I really discovered an enormous world. I began to realize that when people, I tell them I was born in Baghdad, they seem to sort of resonate with the story of 1001 Nights. And, somebody in fact even told me, he says, sometimes even when you look at a lady from that part of the world, we imagine her belly dancing. He says, even if they wear the whole thing, but actually it all come out, in there. It's ingrained. It's the belly dancing, Sinbad the Sailor, Ali Baba, you know. And of course, how can you take this image away that emerges from childhood, from the stories children are taught? This was a problem. And so, to cut a long story short, we developed, I and a few colleagues, an interest in the heritage of science within the Muslim civilization. And then we got interested in the Chinese and the Indian and so on. And later, there was an enormous pressure to try to produce an exhibition that is interactive. And we decided to call it 1001 Inventions instead of 1001 Nights, because it actually tells people that there are also scientific inventions and so on in that part of the world. And I'm really ever so grateful for, because I had to go back and look at what the World of Islam Festival has done. And there was an enormous impact, and became, much later, a close friend of a great inspiration, Paul Keeler, and particularly when he was in Cambridge and working on trying to develop what was called the Golden Web to connect civilizations together. And now this fascinating project of which he hasn't touched yet, and it's called Al-Mizan, right? Of course, Abdullah had mentioned the word Al-Mizan in his recitation, which is the balance and so on, and I'll leave this to Paul to talk about. Great pleasure to be here. I'm really honored, and may this 40 years continue to bring fruits for those people who get exposed and get to know about the real story of Islam and its civilization, and the great number of role models of male and female, a world that has actually enhanced relationships between Christians, Muslims, Sabians, and so on, working together to produce a wonderful civilization that you have seen the side of its art. But I have seen and tried to project this interactive exhibition, the side of science and the side of engineering and technology. Thank you so much for letting me speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your reflections on the importance of science in Islam. Next, we'll move on to Carolyn Montague, who researches questions of civil society in Saudi Arabia. And she was responsible for editing the books and publications that came out of the World of Islam Festival. So we look forward to hearing her reflections on that experience.
Hello. It was amazing. And I will come back to why it was amazing doing those books a little later. Not very much later, a little bit. I sort of drifted into the World of Islam Festival, and I can't remember how at all. I've tried to think. I've lain awake actually at night thinking, how did I get there? But I do know that my first actual sort of interaction with somebody working on it was with a rather portly woman called Daphne, who was the editor, and she interviewed me in an absolutely horrible old cafe in Victoria Station. And I just sort of, it was the 70s. I got 3 small children. I'd been at Cambridge University. I'd lived in Delhi. I had a lot of kind of Muslim friends from Bombay, and a lot of Indian Muslim friends, a lot of Muslim friends. And somehow Daphne was not inspiring. Is she here? I don't think she probably is. Anyway, so I was taken on by Daphne, and off I went to sort of edit these books. Well, edit is a euphemism, actually, certainly for Titus Burkhart's book on Islamic art. Because he didn't actually like any word being changed. It was more or less the same with Martin Ling's too, actually. They were both perfectionists, quite rightly so. I'm glad they were. It actually made my job both more difficult and easier, because I knew I couldn't even change a comma. Actually, in those days, people knew what semicolons were, and colons, and commas, and they could punctuate. So I couldn't even change the punctuation in these books. But I sort of bleated on about the things that needed to be done and what they were. And then with Said Hossein Nasr on sounds, I think I did quite a lot more. I sort of knew him already, I think, from Tehran. Of course, I'd been in Tehran as well, you know, I'd sort of floated around the Middle East a bit. I think I did quite a lot with him. But the book that I turned kind of round and upside down and inside out was a book called Geometric Shapes in Islamic Art. I think it's called that. Is it called that? It's more or less called that. It's out there anyway. And it was by this wonderful Iraqi painter called Issam Said. Do you know of him? Does the name mean anything to any of you over there? Because if it doesn't, please can you remember it? Issam Said. And it was his grandfather, Nur Said, who was dragged as a result of being being involved with the British, dragged round Baghdad at the back of a Range Rover. No, Range Rovers hadn't been invented. Land Rover. And Issam died very early on, probably, 90s? 80s, 90s, yeah, sadly. He's done the most beautiful embossed prints. From time to time, there are small exhibitions of his work. There's a very famous one of 5 Muslim ladies, very beautiful, coloured embossed print, all with little faces showing, bits of faces, and swaying garments, and a beautiful start to a surah that I have of his. And I think he's due for an exhibition, Issam, please, if you possibly could. And so I had to turn his book around because, in a way, he had all the information, but it didn't quite sort of make paragraphs, and the paragraphs didn't quite make chapters. So we did a huge amount of work on that. Then after, yes, and I went on working on those right through and up until the festival. And then I was still there when somebody dropped onto my desk this monumental work on Sana. Huge, which you were supposed to have brought and haven't brought, is that right? Have any of you seen that? It is, I guess there will never be another one, and it was on the architectural history of Sana, and it was in incredible detail, just incredible detail. And I can't think how I did it. I used to kind of weep as I went through to the sort of second or third hour of this very, very precise editing with Arabic and English, transliterated Arabic, I think, and English. Anyway, it came out, and I guess it's a work of very great scholarship. I don't know who it's even by. Do you remember who it's by? Yes, that's right. And that really was the last book that I was involved with. I then was involved with some films, but not the ones that Ahmed Paul Keeler has been talking about, but another lot produced by a company called Inca Films. And we did about 6 films on the exhibitions. Very interesting. I know the woman who did it, she's still alive, but I don't think her films will be digitized, and I guess it would be worth trying to see if we could get them digitized. And I know that Hossein Nasr and I worked extremely hard on the Quranic one, really hard. In the old days, in those sort of black and white days you've just been seeing, we used to sit in a little teeny tiny cinema looking at the rushes and working out whether the film was working correct. And some of those early Qurans are really difficult to tell whether they're right way round or back to front. And we got most of them. In fact, we got all except one. And both he and I let one Quran go into this film, back to front. So if this film is ever digitized, I think we ought to try and turn it round. Because I'm still ashamed of that 40 years on. And the films were, I think, they were on the normal exhibition subjects. And so that was really my great pleasure and hard work. And we really did work extremely hard to get those books going, just as everybody else was working very hard to get the exhibitions going. The designer was a guy called Colin Larkin, not Philip, and a beautiful designer, very fine designer. And I think the other person I would want to mention to you, and I recommend you having a look at the book out there, is Roland Michaud, who did the photographs for Titus Burkhart's book on Islamic art. 5 minutes left. Oh, I don't need 5 minutes. Okay. Because he photographed this Islamic architecture in a different way. He took it head on. He photographed it classically, directly. He didn't go in for any of the kind of romantic movement of photographing things from the side and seeing if we can get romantic angles and all that stuff. Very interesting, and it really works for Islamic architecture. Do go and have a look at that book out there, I suppose. And I think, apart from that, that I think is the most important thing, and I think there's Martin Lings's book is just wonderful. And the Quranic texts were inspiration to me. It was a great experience, and I don't think, for instance, the Royal Academy exhibition on the Turks or the British Museum exhibition on Iran could ever have happened without the World of Islam Festival. And I think what you're all saying about it being the first and greatest of them all is about right. And how lucky you are all to be here to see all of us who are involved with it. And if you want to ask us any questions, don't hesitate to do so.
So, gosh, a lot to discuss. What we hope to do now is to open up a sort of question and answer or a discussion as well. You're welcome to volunteer your own thoughts. A lot of very interesting points were raised, I think, during this final panel. Questions of how modernity, neo-Hanbalism, Orientalism, different aesthetic philosophies have affected the teaching of Islamic art, how the politicization of Islam has affected how Islamic art is taught and displayed. So just going on from those questions, this is really just for my own curiosity, but can I just have a show of hands of the people who had heard of the World of Islam Festival before this event? And don't be shy. Okay, oh, that's actually quite impressive. That's excellent. So, okay, how many people had heard of Edward Said's Orientalism? So, I think that was purely for my own curiosity. I'm actually not even trying to make a point with that. I was just genuinely curious as to how many of you had heard of it, because the legacy, I feel, of the World of Islam Festival has been so important. So my question to the panelists, as well as to the audience, if anyone would like to volunteer an opinion, is what do you see as the legacy of the World of Islam Festival today? We've talked a lot about the legacy in our personal lives, but what about on an institutional level, on an ideological level, in terms of how Islamic art is taught and conceptualized and displayed in the UK and abroad? And then my second question is, would a World of Islam festival be possible today, considering how the use of the term Islam has changed in public discourse in the UK in particular? So I will leave it to the panel to comment, and if anyone has anything to add from the audience, and then after this we'll take some of your questions as well. So is a festival of Islam possible today, in today's UK? Would it be possible to do a World of Islam festival?
I think it would be it'd be sad if we couldn't have a World of Islam festival. In the UK, with the diversity that the world of Islam, if you use that phrase, has. And if we have become so compartmentalized or dirigiste that we couldn't do it, I think that would say something about our values.
Okay, so on that note, I'll turn the questions over to the audience. Yes, we have one gentleman there.
Thanks. My name is Fadla Wumad. I'm working for a charity, Muslim Aid. But I'd just like to ask you, because I worked in Australia for a number of times, there is now Islamic Museum of Australia. And it is making a very important impact on non-Muslims, giving a view of Islam which is not in the media. And when I was at the opening ceremony, and the next week you had 40 school children coming to visit that museum. I was asking, related to this World of Islam Festival, would it be possible to think of getting a museum, Islamic Museum of Britain, with the heritage of Muslims in Britain, the history of Muslims in Britain, the culture of Islam all over the world, to give a better view of Islam and Muslims? Would it be possible to start planning, to think about that? And it's so important today, I think, to have this because how do we overcome the mega preachers of the world who are saying music is haram and this is haram and that is haram, and it's really what my concern is. I became Muslim, when I was 20. That was 5 years ago. But how debased the preaching of Islam has become, and it's affecting Muslims in the Western world. Very much so. So how can we use this World of Islam Festival to give this sort of a view and spread it more widely among the young Muslims in Britain and in the Western world, so that they have a better view? So I have two questions: Islamic Museum of Britain, and second, how to spread this concept of the diversity and
richness, really, of Islam.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I'll leave it to the panelists to answer that question, if anyone would like to volunteer an opinion.
Sorry, could you say something rather personal about museums? Museums were a fantastic idea of the 19th century. They were a wonderful educational tool set up in the 19th century using things to teach with. I think by now, with all the internet, the media, the means of communication, it's a great idea, but let's not call it a museum.
Well, there's different things. The Islamic Dawah side of things can be dealt with by a visitor centre, like they were suggested having at the Woking Mosque, the first one in Britain, something of that kind. A slightly different kind of question, what we're
Do you have
discussing.
a comment?
I mean, from my own personal view, I think existing institutions have a responsibility to reflect Muslim culture in the UK. And I think more emphasis needs to be put on that, not just through our collections, but that we already have, but actually developing them in ways that reflects Muslim society in the UK in a contemporary way. So, I have mixed feelings, and I think I agree with Muhammad Yusuf that there are ways that mosques can do that as well. But I mean, wouldn't rule it out.
And I would say there's also such a rich collection already of Islamic art on display in London. And I mean, I know that, each institution tries to do as much engagement and outreach as possible, both with Muslim communities, diaspora communities, as well as with the general public to communicate that richness. So I think there's certainly an effort already happening. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, more or less. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Anyone? Looking at, I see he's very eager. I know, I'm trying to get some of the... Yeah, that's fine, go ahead. Yes, you have a question.
What is seen today by the native people is that this is just an influx of cultures coming in, disturbing what is there. If you go to any Muslim country in the world, if you go to China, if you go to Russia, you see the architecture, the art is of the land. You don't see an Arab mosque in China. You see a Chinese mosque. You see? So I think what needs to happen in Britain to continue such beautiful work is to build British Islamic culture, beginning with art. Okay? If you have a British mosque, we just talking with Brother Ahmed, and this festival that took place, before I came to England, I came in '77, the master who taught me Islam was telling me that when the Prophet ﷺ said Islam will come from the West, not from Morocco, or Algeria, it will come from this part of the world. And the people of this land will bring Islam back again, which is its values. And I think what you started, and Allah roped you in to become a Muslim, for your son to become, mashallah, a master of reading Quran, and his son to become a hafiz, is already been planned by Allah Almighty God. But for me, 1976 was such a crucial year, because in that year, a lot of the masters of Tasawwuf came to London. And some of the greatest, and if people talk of Sheikh Nazim, his Sheikh was here, Abdullah al-Daghistani from Syria. My own Sheikh Al-Fatih Qaribullah was here, who was turning the head of martyrlings to Tasawwuf when he went to Sudan. Then also Ibrahim Niyas, the Sheikh of King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. Sheikh Muhammad Uthman Sirajuddin from Persia was here. And Sayyid Hussein Nasr, martyrlings, and Guy Eaton, all those people were like a lighting flame to bring that beautiful Islam. And the beginning was you. May Allah reward you for what you did. The heritage can only be when, inshallah, our children and those who are able to come together to bring this again, not just by making an exhibition, but by changing. And Abdul Hakim Murad said to me, not just building a mosque, but having a tomb of a master or a sheikh, inshallah. Shukran.
Any responses? No. Other questions?
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you to Ahmed Keeler, because talking about the legacy is there, and perhaps it's not so obvious, but with my own personal situation, I don't think I'd be a calligrapher today if it wasn't for the publications. I first discovered Islamic art through the publications. My father had found second-hand copies of the various books, and it was my first introduction to the art of Islam. And so, yeah, I'm indebted to everyone who was involved in the festival.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. I feel very much the same way, which is why I initially got involved in this. I mean, you really feel the impact. I mean, both of the sort of underpinning aesthetic philosophy that went into the world of Islam and the overarching narrative, as well as in the publications. I mean, I think they influenced a lot of people and shaped their education and their interests. So other questions from the audience?
Thank you to the organisers for putting together this wonderful event. And thank you to Paul Ahmed Keeler and other panellists today. I'd like to say that I feel I don't still understand exactly what the legacy of this will be. And I'm still discovering, I had no idea of the extent of the festival being quite as broad and wide as it was. So I think there's an untold story there to actually, you know, which you've all hinted at today, the story of the festival and its impact. And I hope that some of you might be moved to write, a chapter, an article, a small book, or whatever, on the history of the festival and its impact. I think that would be great value to all of us to understand how it went on. I have one particular, that was a comment, one really short question, really to anybody on the panel. Do you think that in a way the festival marks a moment where the Muslim populations that had moved to Britain after the war had not yet reached into central cultural institutions in Britain? That's a process that's still ongoing. And at the same time, this kind of theme, the kind of spiritual theme of unity that was there, it's been apparent throughout all the presentations today and the structure of the festival itself, this idea of Tawheed as a unifying spiritual factor. I find it really hard to imagine that an exhibition of such size could be mounted in Britain today with this kind of underlying spiritual theme. I think the reasons why we can debate, but I find it seems to be of such a moment, coming at the end of the 60s and 70s, that decade when I think that there was a generation that came of age that was open to spiritual influences outside of Europe, and so it seems hard to me to imagine that happening today.
In the 1970s, early 1970s, we were living in a world where the perception of Dar al-Islam was very fragmented. It was a world in which nationalism had taken root and was defining everywhere. When you picked up a book about the Islamic world, it generally ended it with Iran. The Indian subcontinent was something else. And so what I believe was the profound aspect of the festival was this concept of unity. But we were living in a much more innocent world, a world in which the hierarchies of knowledge were still very much intact. I was just saying that one of the extraordinary coincidences that made the festival possible was the extraordinary scholarship of the curators and the librarians in the whole museum library area. And they had time. They were not administrators. No,
You're gesturing toward the curators on this side of the table.
No, you told me. They don't have the time to study. These people, the scholar librarian was king. So in those days, there was a deep scholarship that was a deeply fragmented understanding. I had a conversation in Cairo at the ambassador's house, where a very senior academic was making the point that there was no such thing as Islamic art. And this was a common concept. But the point is that at that time, unity was very important. And that was the great theme. However, now things are very different. We live in a world which is in deep crisis. And the great crisis of our time is that the world is out of balance. And this is why I asked my son to read that wonderful surah of Rahman, which deals with Mizan, which deals with how Almighty Allah created the universe in Mizan, in balance, justice, measure. So now, for the Muslims, the Muslim opportunity now is phenomenal. Because everyone can experience, and everyone in their daily lives experiences the fact that we are out of balance. We know this. We have destroyed the balance in terms of the natural world. We're out of balance in our families. Family life is under pressure. Communities have been destroyed. We're living in a world of extremes, extreme wealth, extreme poverty. And this balance, when we look at Islam from this perspective, we see a Dar al-Islam in which this principle defined the world that was created. It is manifested through the art, through the knowledge, through the great work of the Sharia, through tasawwuf, through all these elements, but they were all integrated and whole and in a state of al-mizan. What has happened during this very tormented time that we're living in is that everything has been torn apart. So some go to this, some go to that, some go to the other. But from the great work of Imam al-Ghazali, the proof of Islam, from that moment when the balance and everything was put in its correct place, Islam spread right across the world. Islam went into every culture. Why? Because the whole of the manifestation of Al-Mizan, that was realized. And that was the other thing, that when I encountered Islam, I encountered the beauty of Islam. And that beauty only is manifested when everything is in a state of balance. So this is the huge wealth that the Muslims have. And this is what needs to be realized for our time. Because everybody is crying out. Everyone is suffering. Whether they're from whatever culture, they are suffering because of the terrible breaking of Al-Mizan. So what we do now, what projects that take place to help this, what initiatives are dealt with, they have to be ones in which the glory, the spirit, the love, the understanding of Islam is once more resonated. Because now it's terrible. If you think of the term Islam, if you think of the term jihad, if you think of the term of the glorious Sharia, that huge, monumental work, now these terms, you can't use them. Immediately a barrier comes up. Terror, fear. So it's very serious. The situation that the Muslims face today is very dangerous. And we have to recover a glorious vision, a generous vision, a vision that is full of compassion. And all of that is contained within this fundamental principle of Al-Mizan. This principle that through realizing it brings peace. Because it is only by being in a state of balance that you can actually have peace. And this the great sheikhs had taught us. And this is what Islamic art tells us. And this is what the music of Islam tells us. And this is what the way of life of the Muslim tells us. Everything is in its proper place. Our duties towards Almighty Allah, our duties towards human community, and our duties towards the creation of Almighty Allah. These three spheres in perfect balance. So whatever we do now, we have to really think very deeply of how can we recover, reclaim, revive, because these are the words that belong to Islam. Every century, every time, reviving, recovering, reclaiming back to what is the perfection that Almighty Allah has given us. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very poignant and eloquent note on which to end. If there were any other questions, I'm sure you can come up and discuss with the panelists now.